The king who survived his coronation. On what comes after the heroic phase. A king was crowned at the age of 20. He had not, before the coronation, expected to be king. He had been the second son. His older brother had been the heir. His older brother had died 2 months before the old king's death of a fever in a province he had been visiting. The kingdom had been thrown into the kind of brief chaos kingdoms enter when an heir dies without warning. The council had met. The council had confirmed him, the second son, as the new heir. The old king had then died on schedule, and the second son had been crowned, and his life had begun. The kingdom was at war. It had been at war in some form for 60 years. The war was old. It had grown so old that no one remembered with any precision what it had begun about. There had been in the first generation a question of borders. There had been in the second a question of trade. There had been in the third a question of insult. By the time of his coronation, the war was, in some sense, simply what the kingdom did. The neighboring kingdom was, in some sense, what the kingdom defined itself against. He led the armies for 40 years. He won every war the kingdom had to fight, and several it did not. He had been from the beginning an unusually good general. He had a sense for terrain that older generals did not have. He had a sense for the timing of attacks. He had, perhaps most importantly, the kind of personal courage that made other men, when they followed him, do better than they would have done following another man. He led from the front. He was wounded 11 times in the 40 years. None of the wounds was mortal. He came home from each campaign with a new scar and a new province for the kingdom. He brought peace to provinces that had not known it in a century. He brought, through his various victories, the neighboring kingdom to a slow exhaustion. The neighboring kingdom had, by his 58th year, sued for terms. The terms had been generous. The peace had been signed. The two kingdoms had agreed at last, after 60 years of war, to be at peace with each other indefinitely. He was beloved. The kingdom had not, in centuries, loved a king the way it loved him. Songs were written about him. His statue stood in every market square. His face was on the coins. Children in the schools were taught his battles in chronological order. His name had become, by his 58th year, a kind of national emblem. Mothers named their sons after him. Old men cried when they saw him pass in his coach. At 60, he sat at last on the throne in peace. He sat for a long time. The peace, after he had signed it, had held. There had been no rebellions, no border skirmishes, no demands from the neighboring kingdom that he had not, in the treaty, foreseen. The court had settled into the routines of a kingdom no longer at war. The council met less frequently. The army was reduced by half. The treasury, which had been depleted by 60 years of war, began to recover. The king sat on his throne. He received ambassadors. He signed papers. He attended ceremonies. He held the office. He could not remember why the wars had been fought. This came to him gradually in his 62nd year. He had been reviewing with his chief minister the history of the war for some ceremonial purpose, the dedication of a monument, perhaps, or a speech he was to give. The chief minister had walked him through the major engagements. He had listened, nodding. He had realized partway through that he could not, in any deep sense, remember what the war had been about. He could remember the battles. He could remember the names of his enemies. He could not remember why he had been fighting them. He had asked the chief minister. The chief minister had given the official answer: borders, trade, insult. The king had nodded again. The official answer had not satisfied him. He had not, however, pressed. He had, in the months that followed, asked himself the question every evening. He could not answer it. He sent for his crown, which was kept in a great chamber and only worn for ceremony, and asked it. The crown was brought in by a young page. The young page set it on a cushion on a small table beside the throne. The young page withdrew. The king was alone with the crown. "Crown," he said. The crown did not answer immediately. The crown was very old. It had been worn by many kings. It had been first forged, the king knew, 600 years before, by a smith of legendary skill. It had been polished, in its long life, by perhaps 100 different hands. "Yes," said the crown at last. The king had not, before that moment, known the crown could speak. He was not, however, surprised. He had become, in his 62 years, the kind of man who was no longer surprised by much. "Why was I made king?" The crown took a moment. "You were not made king," said the crown. "You were made the king's instrument. The kingdom needed a sword. You were the sword. You were placed on the throne so that the sword could be near at hand." Brother who died of fever was the one who had been bred to be king. He had been the kind of man who would have been a king in peace. He would not have won the war. He would have negotiated a peace earlier, less favorable but stable. The kingdom would have continued. He died. The kingdom had no king in peace available. The kingdom needed a king in war. You were available. You were placed on the throne. You won the war. The wars have ended. The sword is no longer needed. The throne is still here. What am I to do? You became king at the cost of being a man. I know. Now that the wars are done, the question is whether you can become a man at the cost of being a king. The king sat with this. How would I do that? You may not be able to, most cannot. Most simply sit on the throne for the rest of their lives, growing slowly thinner until they die and another sword is found. The kingdom does not, in those cases, require them to actively do anything. The throne, once a sword is on it, is content to have the sword sit until the sword rusts. The kingdom continues around it. The sword does not, in those final decades, suffer in any dramatic way. The sword merely grows thinner. The sword's family, its wife, its children grow accustomed to the thinning. The sword dies. The kingdom buries the sword with honor. Another sword is found in the next generation when the next war comes. The kingdom is patient. It does not, by its nature, require the sword to become a man, and the few who do. The few who can become men in their old age usually do so by leaving the throne. The throne does not permit them to do it in this room. They leave at night. They take very little with them. They go and live somewhere ordinary. They do small things. They make bread, or chop wood, or tend sheep. They are happy in a way they have never been happy. They are, in time, forgotten. The kingdom continues without them. The council finds another sword, or sometimes a different kind of king, a king in peace, who would not have been suitable in the war years but who is suitable now. The new king takes the throne. The old king in the small village dies in his own time, of his own age, in his own bed, and is buried in the village cemetery with no honors. He is, by then, a man. He is, in some sense, what he was made to be before the war. The king sat for another month before he decided. He did not, in that month, share the question with anyone. He could not. His wife had died in his 50th year of a small illness. His children were grown. One had become a general. One had married a foreign prince. One had died young of the same fever that had killed his brother. He had no friends. He had not, in his 40 years of war, made any. He had only had subordinates, allies, and enemies. He decided one evening in his garden. He left at night, as the crown had said. He did not take the crown with him. He did not take any servants. He took a small bag of money, a single change of clothes, and the small wooden flute he had played as a boy and that he had kept, all his life, in a drawer he rarely opened. He walked out through a small servant's gate that the night porter, who recognized him but said nothing, opened for him. He walked for 3 days. He came, on the 4th morning, to a small village in a remote province he had not, in his 40 years of war, visited. The village was on a small river. The houses were small. The people were ordinary. They did not, when he arrived in his peasant clothes, recognize him. He had, by the wear of 3 days walking, looked enough like a peasant to pass. He took a small room above the bakery. He lived for 15 more years. He chopped wood for the baker. He made bread in time when the baker grew old. He learned in his late 60s to make a kind of small dense loaf that the village had not in its history eaten before. The villagers found it delicious. They bought it. The bakery prospered. The old king was paid in small coins, in courtesies, in the kind of warmth that a small village gives to a man who makes good bread. He was called by his neighbors by his first name, which he had not heard spoken since he was 19. In the palace, the crown was placed on another head. The council, after some weeks of confusion, had found a cousin of the king's, a man of 46, who had been a minor magistrate in a southern province, and who was the kind of king in peace the crown had described. The crown had nodded in some sense in agreement. The cousin had been a good king. The kingdom had prospered under him. The old king died at 75. He died in the small room above the bakery on a winter morning, of his own age and his own contentment. The village buried him in the village cemetery. The stone said only his first name and the years of his life. The village had never learned, in 15 years, who he had been before. A scholar, some decades later, in researching the history of the kingdom, came across an account of the old king's mysterious disappearance and traced his steps, eventually, to the small village. He stood at the grave for some time. He did not put up a new stone. He understood, in some way the kingdom had not understood, that the old king had succeeded, in his last 15 years, at what the crown had described, at becoming a man at the cost of being a king. The grave is, in some province, still there. The bread, in some sense, is still being made. The sword that is needed in war is not needed. In peace, the man behind the sword he must learn to put down the sword, leave the throne, and become a man. Most do not. The few who do leave at night. They take very little. They are happy in a way they have never been happy. They are forgotten. The kingdom continues without them. The grave in the small village has only the first name. It is enough. VII. Tales from the Desert.